This is Molly Hemingway of The Federalist, inviting you to join me for the 2026 Issues, Etc. Making the Case Conference, Friday, June 12th and Saturday, June 13th at Concordia University, Chicago. I'll be speaking and signing copies of my new book, Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the U.S. Constitution. Learn more at issuesetc.org. issuesetc.org.
The emperor has no clothes on. He's buck naked. That child had to speak the truth no matter how it would make the king feel. And we have to do that today. We have to be very conscientious objectors to the madness that is gender ideology.
And most people default into this idea of feminism is this idea that men are contemptible, which is, of course, the idea behind the smashing the patriarchy, and women need to be just like them and have the same equality.
The Crusades were a very belated response to many centuries of Muslim conquests, in which 2/3 of the old Christian world had already fallen to Muslim conquest.
And our faith is strong, not because of the fervor of its affection, but because of the object to which it clings, Christ. And there is no stronger faith than a really timid grasping to the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
Families sailing on their family vacation on lakes in Minnesota love Issues, Etc.
We love Issues, Etc. Woo!
The long series of military campaigns that have come to be known as the Crusades have a bad reputation among historians and especially among people who don't know history. But the more you know about the Crusades, the clearer the picture becomes that many of them failed to achieve their objective. And in the end, they just kind of fizzled out. The real winner, after all was said and done, was, of all things, the Ottoman Empire, the inhabited Islamic world, which stood until, well, the first part of the 20th century. Greetings and welcome to Issues, Etc., live on this Monday afternoon, June the 8th. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for tuning us in. We're going to spend the next 2 hours concluding our 4-part series on the Crusades. Dr. Thomas Madden joins us. He's professor of history at St. Louis University, author of the book, The Concise History of the Crusades, and a forthcoming publication, The Fall of Republics. Dr. Madden, welcome back.
Thanks very much.
Was the Fifth Crusade that we're going to discuss today, was it an attempt to kind of finish the business of the previous crusade?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. It was certainly seen that way by Pope Innocent III. Remember, Pope Innocent, when he had been elevated in 1198, his first action was to call a crusade to redeem Jerusalem. And that crusade had gone so far off the rails, the Fourth Crusade, and spun completely out of his control, that it ended up conquering Constantinople. Now, Innocent was willing to accept that and, in fact, saw it as the healing of the schism wrongly. That's the way he saw it for the rest of his life. But he still wanted to have the crusade that would redeem Jerusalem. But things just kept coming up throughout his pontificate. There was the problem of the Albigensian Crusade, which dealt with heretics in the south of France, and that sapped a lot of the energy that would have been used for a new crusade to Jerusalem. So he had a very, very full pontificate. He was very busy, but he never forgot the idea of the crusade. And so the crowning achievement of his pontificate was the Fourth Lateran Council, which was held in 1215 in Rome. This was an ecumenical council that brought the prelates from all across Europe, but not only Europe now, because now the Patriarch of Constantinople is a Catholic. And so the Patriarch of Constantinople attends. You also have the Patriarch of Jerusalem who attends. So it's really a very large meeting held in Rome in 1215. And it's a reform council. It's all about reforming the church, but also reforming Christian society. And at the very end of this council, which kind of brings it all together, Innocent calls the new crusade and lays out precisely how it's going to work. The encyclical that goes out that refers to this talks specifically about a new Muslim fortress that had just been built on Mount Tabor. So Mount Tabor was the mountain that was traditionally believed to be the mountain of the transfiguration of Christ. And so the idea of an Ayyubid or Muslim fortress on that mountain was of great concern. So this went out all across Europe, the call for the crusade. Innocent said that he would be there personally to bless the fleet as it left. He also wanted to make sure that he had a papal legate who would be every step of the way on this crusade so that it wouldn't spin out of control in the same way that the Fourth Crusade had. And so there was a lot of fanfare, and the crusade was called. As it happens, however, Innocent did not live long enough to see the crusade begin. He died in 1216. And so it was left to his successor, Honorius, to be the pope who would kind of take the reins of this. The biggest high-profile monarch who took the cross was the Holy Roman Emperor, the young Frederick II, who was an extremely powerful man because a very young man. But he was not only the ruler of Germany, of the princes of Germany, but he was also the ruler of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Norman kingdom in the south of Italy. And so the amount of resources that he could bring to bear were quite large. Frederick surprised everyone by taking the cross and devoting himself to this cause. So there was great hope for the crusade. As it happened, however, Frederick, with an empire that large, he was always busy with something. First, putting down German princes who were rebellious. Then he had problems also in the Norman kingdoms. So the years went by, and although it was clear that he was focused on it, he could not get away to go on the crusade. But other kings and other leaders did. Among those kings, other kings who went, the king of Hungary, Andrew II, took the cross. This was actually a vow that he had inherited, really, from his brother Emmerich, who had never went on crusade before he died. And Andrew left with a very large fleet, and they all headed to Acre and to the Holy Land, with the idea that Frederick would be there soon. And so it was a sizable force that they brought there, but the idea was that Frederick would be joining them. And Frederick had sent word that no major action should be done until he could get there. Andrew was a kind of a lukewarm crusader, so he didn't really want to wait. He took some of his men and actually marched not very far to Mount Tabor, attacked that fortress unsuccessfully, and then marched back to Acre and declared his crusade over. And so he left. Others would be coming, but it would be the same kind of thing. And this is something that would be kind of an element in the Fifth Crusade that was unlike the previous crusades. And that is that there's a kind of a churn in the crusaders who are actually there. You would have different groups of crusaders arrive. They would stay for a while, but once they had decided that they thought their vow was complete, then they would just return. And so there's this amount kind of coming and going of crusaders throughout the Fifth Crusade that makes it different than the earlier ones. Ultimately, once they had a large enough mass in Acre, the titular king of Jerusalem, John of Brienne, made the decision to follow the plan of the Fourth Crusade, which had been to go and attack Egypt. By this time, we're talking about 1217, by this time it had pretty much been decided that the only way they were going to be able to hold Jerusalem was to conquer Egypt. And so from there, they sail off to Egypt. And ultimately, they land at this town called Damietta, which is on the coast, very close to the coast, on one of the tributaries of the Nile River. And they begin the siege of Damietta in May of 1218. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, marches up to contest the siege. And this will be a very long process. The siege of Damietta will last well over a year, with both sides skirmishing against each other. And all behind all of this, there's this kind of specter of Frederick II, that Frederick is coming, and that when he does arrive, everything's going to change because he's going to have a very large force with him. And so the siege drags on month after month. Al-Kamil is a very shrewd leader, the Sultan of Egypt. He knows that this is going to be a very difficult situation if Frederick arrives. And so even before the city ultimately falls, he begins offering deals to the Crusaders to leave. He's making various offers. And in fact, he offers to give them Jerusalem if they will break the siege and leave Egypt. Now, that might seem like a very good deal. And in fact, many of the Crusaders thought it was a good deal. But that was not precisely the reason that they had come on the crusade. Remember, they're in Egypt to break the back of Muslim power so that it is no longer a threat to Jerusalem. What he's offering them is essentially the final aim of the crusade if they'll just leave Egypt. So there was a lot of disagreement as to whether that was a good deal or not. The military orders were opposed to the deal. John of Brienne was favorable in certain circumstances to the deal, but the newly arrived papal legate, a Portuguese prelate named Pelagius, was very much opposed to it. And Pelagius was in a real position of power on this crusade. So throughout the rest of this crusade, you're going to have a kind of a power struggle between John of Brienne and Pelagius. And because the Crusaders themselves are such a large group of different kinds of nationalities and others, you have Italians, you have French, you have Germans, they tend to kind of cluster in different groups, either between one or the other. And into all this, of course, comes one of the more famous scenes or episodes in the history of the Crusades, and that is the arrival of St. Francis of Assisi. Francis was the hit of Europe at this time. His order, the Franciscan order, or the Friars Minor, the Order of the Little Brothers, had really taken Europe by storm. This was extremely popular. All of the towns in Europe were getting Franciscans in them. And in these early days, Francis very much saw his order as a missionary order. And he had it in mind that he wanted to convert the Muslims. Now, he knew that this would be very difficult because in Islamic law, apostasy gets the death penalty right away. And so he knew that anywhere that they went, people would be very reluctant to convert. But more than that, they would come after the missionaries. But he believed that with enough faith and with enough martyrs, that God would give them this victory. So Francis is not going on crusade to fight, but he is very much going on crusade. And the idea behind this is that he wants to preach to the Sultan of Egypt because he believes that if the Sultan of Egypt will convert to Christianity, and then all of Egypt can convert to Christianity, and that there would be no need for the crusade any longer. Egypt would be under Christian control. So when Francis arrives with a few brothers at Damietta, he asks the papal legate for permission to go and preach to the Sultan. And he's initially told that he can't. He's very persistent. And so finally, he's allowed to go there. And he literally just walks up to the Sultan's camp. Probably he would have been killed. And there's no doubt that Francis expected to be martyred. But as it happened, the Sultan was waiting for a response to his latest offer to have the Crusaders break the siege. And so almost certainly Al-Kamil believed that Francis and his group were there to discuss things. And it certainly wouldn't help his position to kill their holy man. So Francis was actually brought in to have a personal meeting with Al-Kamil. And although this episode has been reimagined many times over the centuries, what our best evidence for it is that Francis simply told the Sultan that if he did not convert to Christianity, he could not enter heaven, that he needed to be baptized, and that Francis was willing to die to save Al-Kamil's soul. There were a number of people apparently who wanted to kill him, but as I said, Al-Kamil knew that once he realized that this was not part of a negotiating party, he realized that killing Francis was not going to help his position with the Crusaders. Ultimately, Al-Kamil told him that Francis should pray that Al-Kamil would make the decision that was most pleasing to God. And with that, Francis left and went back to Europe. So he did not get the martyrdom that he had been expecting. The siege continued on well after Francis's departure. In fact, it went on so long, and the Crusaders were able to cut the city off, that one day they simply looked at the walls of the city and realized that there was no one on the walls. It turned out there was mass starvation in the city. There had been a lot of disease. It had really become a city of the dead. And this was largely because Al-Kamil had been forced to retreat because of a bit of a rebellion in Egypt. And that allowed the Crusaders to be able to cut the whole city off. So once the city fell, the Crusaders were able to take it. They had to clean it up because it was a pretty bad situation there. Bodies everywhere. But ultimately, they capture the city and they take it over. And now that means that all they have to do is wait for Frederick to show up. And Frederick sends word that they should, prepare the city, don't leave, don't march towards Cairo, which is the ultimate goal here, but wait for him to show up. And so during that next year, the army is just stuck in the city of Damietta. And that's never good for an army. So ultimately, they decide that to kind of make a compromise. And the compromise is that they will take half of the crusade and keep them in Damietta to hold that. And then the other half of the crusade will march toward Mansourah, which is a fortified town further up the Nile, and capture that, because that will be a good base from which to make the final push to Cairo. And so that's what they do. The process towards Mansourah goes fairly quickly, but once they actually arrive there, they're not able to meaningfully attack the city. They also don't understand the hydrography of the Nile, because Al-Kamil ultimately just opens the sluice gates on the Nile and floods the whole plain that they're in, forcing them ultimately to have to surrender. So half of the crusade, which was with John of Brienne and with Pelagius, that had marched to Mansourah, they're completely surrounded now. They can't fight. They have to surrender. They probably would have expected to be cut down, but as I said, Al-Kamil really wants the Crusaders gone, and he wants them gone before Frederick arrives. And so he treats them very well, but he makes a deal with them. And the deal is they have to give up Damietta and they have to all leave. They're not going to get Jerusalem anymore, but he will give them their lives. They can all leave as long as they hand over Damietta. And as a little sweetener, he promises to give them the true cross so that it won't be a complete failure. And so ultimately that's what happens. They are forced to surrender Damietta. They all get back into boats and they all return home. And there was no true cross. It appears once again, one of the sultans tried to get hold of it and no one could find it because really it had been destroyed already. So the Fifth Crusade, it is the crusade that is always seems like it's just on the brink of success. And it just, in the end, it failed miserably.
Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. We're concluding our series on the Crusades. When we come back, how did the Fifth Crusade secularize Jerusalem?
This is Megan Basham of the Daily Wire, inviting you to join me for the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case Conference, Friday, June 12th and Saturday, June 13th at Concordia University, Chicago. I'll be speaking and signing copies of my book, Shepherds for Sale. And joining me at this annual conference for Christian laity are Molly Hemingway of The Federalist, Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch, and Aaron Hawley of Alliance Defending Freedom. Learn more at issuesetc.org, issuesetc.org.
At the heart of Lutherans for Life is good news. Good news that brings hope to a culture so focused on death. Lutherans for Life equips Lutherans and their neighbors to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Lutherans for Life believes God gives the gift of life to all people, from the moment of conception until natural death. Learn more about how you and your congregation can help bring hope and healing to all the life issues through a wide variety of resources and caring activities at lutheransforlife.org.
Solid, serious, substantive. You're listening to Issues Etc.
For nearly 140 years, the Lutheran Witness has taught the faith, defended it against error, and shown forth the great treasures of the Lutheran Church and biblical doctrine. We're continuing this legacy by publishing issues and articles that help you see the world from a Lutheran perspective and that teach biblical doctrine and show forth the treasures of God's Word. Visit our website to learn more and how to subscribe, witness.lcms.org. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.
Every child should have the opportunity for a beautiful classical education. Simply Classical offers curriculum for students who have learning challenges. Each subject moves at a slower pace with lots of repetition to foster mastery. This Christian curriculum is accessible to all, so any child can receive a beautiful education. Learn more at simplyclassical.com. Save $5 when you enter the coupon code LPR26MP. Simply Classical, classical education for students with special needs. Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest, author of the book, The Concise History of the Crusades. Dr. Madden, that Fifth Crusade, while it did ostensibly return Jerusalem, you say it also secularized the city. How so?
Well, the Fifth Crusade, when it leaves, Jerusalem is still in Muslim hands. The walls of the city had been destroyed because Al-Kamil expected that the Crusaders would take the deal. And so what he wanted to do was give them a city that was indefensible. But Frederick II, remember, is still preparing a crusade. And he's in a lot of hot water when the Fifth Crusade fails because everyone's blaming him. So he makes a deal with Honorius, with the Pope, that he will absolutely, positively go on crusade, and that if he doesn't, he will be automatically excommunicated. And so the plan is for him to go on this crusade. And in fact, he even marries the daughter of John of Brienne, Isabella. She's the actual queen of Jerusalem. And so he marries her, and he himself takes the title King of Jerusalem as the consort of the queen. So he's completely prepared to go. But while he's preparing in those last years before he leaves, he opens negotiations with Al-Kamil. And Al-Kamil at that point is in a war with his brother, and he does not want Frederick to come and mess that up. So Al-Kamil essentially offers the same deal to Frederick. And that is, if he comes to Jerusalem, that Al-Kamil will give Jerusalem to Frederick. And all Frederick really needs to do is not attack him and maybe help him out a little bit with his war with his brother. Frederick thinks this is a great plan. He seems to he does strike up a real friendship with the envoy from Al-Kamil. Frederick has every reason to leave on time for this crusade because the fix is really already in. So he leaves in 1226, but ultimately is forced to come back because of disease. He then becomes excommunicated. As a result of that, the new Pope, Gregory IX, refuses to make any more deals. And so Frederick is actually excommunicated when he then goes on crusade the next year. At this point, the young, kind of idealistic Frederick has become a much older now and much more cynical man. And his position is that you can excommunicate me if you want, but once I've captured Jerusalem, you're going to have to bring me back. So Frederick arrives at Acre, ready to have Jerusalem handed to him. He knows the deal is going to be to hand him Jerusalem. But by the time he arrives, because he was delayed, Al-Mu'azzam, the brother of Al-Kamil, has died. And that means Al-Kamil doesn't really need this deal anymore. So Frederick begins marching on Jaffa to make it clear that they should come to an agreement. And finally, Al-Kamil makes a deal. And Frederick and Al-Kamil make a deal to get Jerusalem. Except it really is, as you say, secularized, because what it does is it really becomes kind of a legalistic victory. It's not the redemption of Jerusalem, in other words, to bring it back completely under Christian control, but rather, essentially what it says is that Christians can titularly call themselves the rulers, but the Muslims who live in the city have to be left alone. They have to live, in their current places. They have to live under Islamic law. The holy sites on Temple Mount have to be left in Muslim control. So really the only thing that Christians get is access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And they're also forbidden from building fortifications there or in any way militarizing the city. And so, and they get a 10-year truce. And so this deal essentially just is a legalistic deal that allows Frederick to say that he restored Jerusalem, when in fact nothing really happened on the ground. Once the rest of the Crusaders find out about the deal, it's very strongly opposed. In fact, the Patriarch of Jerusalem not only opposes it, but he places Jerusalem, the holiest city, under interdict, which means that sacraments cannot be performed there, because Frederick wants to have a big celebration at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which ultimately he can't do. So with that, Frederick leaves, and he has a 10-year truce in place. Anyone who doesn't accept that, he essentially makes war on Christians who don't accept that. And so many of the native barons, the native Christians who lived in that area, they saw Frederick's crusade more as a crusade against them rather than against the Muslims. And although Jerusalem could be legally said to be under Christian control, it was not in any meaningfully way under Christian control, at least not from a medieval point of view. It was very much had become a kind of a secular spot. And after the 10 years were over with, the Muslims simply came back in and took the city and kicked the Christians out, which had always been the plan. In fact, that's what Al-Kamil said he would do to other Muslims who were very critical of him, and that's what they did.
Dr. Thomas Madden of St. Louis University and author of the book, The Concise History of the Crusades, is our guest. We're concluding our series on the Crusades, and we'll talk about how that secularization of Jerusalem led to the Crusades of St. Louis.
Looking for high-quality church music settings? Look no further than Concordia Publishing House. We have award-winning settings for handbell, organ, piano, and choral groups, featuring a wide variety of options for the entire church year. Visit cph.org/music to find a great setting today.
Luther Academy provides additional theological education for our mission partners around the world, specifically pastors who are asking for additional education but do not have the necessary resources in their own church bodies. By donating to Luther Academy today, you will be supplying food, housing, books, professors, and travel for Lutheran pastors who attend our conferences. To learn more about Luther Academy and how you can donate today, visit lutheracademy.com. lutheracademy.com.
We love our on-demand listeners. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
St. Mark Lutheran Church in Waco, Texas is proud to support Issues, Etc. Join us for worship and Bible study. If you're in Waco for business, college, traveling through the city, looking for a great place to retire, or searching for a church to receive Jesus' love and forgiveness, then visit St. Mark, a century-old Christ-centered Lutheran congregation in the heart of Waco, very near the silos. The Lord Jesus Christ be with you always. Visit us at stmarkwaco.com.
Hymnody is important, very important. It's an invaluable tool that helps teach and confess the faith. Singing hymns is something we all do together on a weekly basis, yet some congregations find it difficult to sing confidently without the support of an instrument. If you are one of these congregations that can't find an organist, Church Music Solutions can help. Our substitute organist service allows your hymns and liturgy to be played on your instrument to help inspire and support your congregation's song. Keep singing with Church Music Solutions.
Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. On this Monday, June the 8th, we're concluding our four-part series on the Crusades. Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. You mentioned before the break the secularization of Jerusalem. How did that circumstance there occasion the Crusades of St. Louis?
Yeah, these were going to come later. Jerusalem in those intervening years is going to, over the next decade or so, and particularly after it goes back to Muslim control, it's going to go kind of back and forth under Christian control and Muslim control, largely because of things like the Barons' Crusade or the Crusade of Theobald. These are crusades in which they essentially are able to negotiate the Christians being in charge of the city again. So these are going to go back and forth and back and forth. But under the young king, Louis IX, St. Louis of France, he hears of the fall of Jerusalem, and not just the fall, but the massacre of the Christian population there under a Turkish force. And so Louis, when he hears about this, he's a very pious man. I mean, he's a saint. So, he's a very pious man. And he had become quite ill. And when he heard about what had happened in Jerusalem, he promised God that if he was healed, that he would take the cross and he would use his considerable resources to restore Jerusalem. And now his mother, Blanche of Castile, she was very much opposed to this, and she had only just recently stopped being the regent control. So she, as soon as he got better, she had the Bishop of Paris nullify the oath, saying that, he was not in his right mind. So Louis immediately, even in his bed, immediately took the oath again. And he told his mother that, look, you can get this annulled as many times as you want, but I'm always going to take the cross again because I'm going to go and restore Jerusalem. So there was no talking him out of it. And he leaves in 1248. He brings pretty much, aside from his mother, who his mother's going to run France while he's gone, but he brings his brothers, he brings his wife, his young wife, Margaret of Provence. And in fact, his wife will end up having 2 children by him on the crusade. But, he has brothers like, these are powerful men in their own right, Charles of Anjou, Robert of Artois, and they're all going now on this crusade. It's the largest crusade. In fact, it may be the largest of all the crusades. The kings of France, by the time of Louis, were in a very good situation. They had a very firm control over their kingdoms, and they're able to bring a lot of resources to bear. So they sail to Cyprus, and everyone kind of organizes at Cyprus, which is a Christian holding. And there they have a council of war to talk about where they're going to go. Ultimately, because the king is there, it's his decision. And so he decides that they are going to attack Egypt. So it's the same idea. Let's attack Egypt, capture it, and then we'll be in a situation where we can take Jerusalem easily. Now, obviously, Louis IX is going to be looking at the Fifth Crusade. A lot of time has gone by since then, and so there's been plenty of time for people to think about what went wrong. And he studied the Fifth Crusade very carefully, and he believes that, it began well and that he can avoid the mistakes before. So they arrive in 1249 at Damietta, the same place. They begin besieging the city of Damietta. The Ayyubid Sultan's forces, As-Salah's, he doesn't position his forces very well, and he's not able to contest the landing. But also, they begin backing up from the main city as the French forces come forward. And when they do that, a lot of the garrison in the city starts to believe that they're being abandoned. And so they begin leaving the city. And then the people of Damietta, because there's still plenty of stories about what happened during the Fifth Crusade, where people lived in this horrible place for a year, the people of the city begin thinking that they're being abandoned. And so they all grab everything they can grab, and they flee too. So although Louis arrives thinking that he's going to be besieging this very difficult city for maybe a year or so, it actually falls within a day, and the whole city is completely emptied out. So he naturally sees this as the right decision. God is clearly very happy with him in his estimate. Shortly thereafter, after getting control of Damietta, they receive word from the Sultan that he is willing to trade, possibly. And so there is a lot of discussion about, should we trade Damietta for Jerusalem? There's no clear plan to do this at this stage, but there is a faction within the crusade that argues that rather than march to Mansourah and then to Cairo, they would be better off if they stayed on the coast. And so rather what they should do is take their fleet and attack Alexandria, capture the city of Alexandria, and then with both of those cities, they would be in a very good situation to negotiate the return of almost everything in the Holy Land. It's a very attractive idea, but Louis ultimately decides against it. And the reason is because he believes that the success at Damietta makes it clear that God wants them to continue forward along the original plan. So they begin their march from Damietta up the Nile, which is south down, making their way very slowly towards Mansoura. He wants to ensure that he doesn't get caught the way the Fifth Crusade did. Ultimately, they finally arrive at Mansoura, and without going into too much detail, they have a major battle there at Mansoura and in 1250, and ultimately they're successful. They capture at least the fortifications around Mansoura and theoretically, they have the way that they can move towards Cairo. However, in the battle for Mansoura, they lost many more people than they expected, including Robert of Artois, the brother of the king. And they also find themselves increasingly in a more and more difficult situation. The Sultan at the time, Turan Shah, he's able to essentially take dismantled vessels and put them on camels and bring them across the desert and then reassemble them in the Nile. And he's able to cut the French off from their base in Damietta as a result of that. And so as the summer begins in 1250, they realize that they're in an increasingly untenable position. In fact, it's becoming less and less likely that they can even make it back to Damietta without a lot of casualties. So the thinking is that the best thing to do would be to flee and to try to get back to Damietta. But Louis just really believes that if he just has faith that this will all work out, and he has some reason to believe this, they've been getting a lot of intelligence that there might be a rebellion brewing in Cairo, and that if that rebellion happened, it would really make things much easier for him. Turan Shah was very much disliked by the Turkish slave corps. There was a very large army that was used in Egypt that were slaves. They were Turks, known as Mamluks. And there was a belief that the Mamluks were going to overthrow the Turan Shah, the Ayyubid Sultan. So he was kind of waiting for that, but it didn't materialize. And eventually they finally were forced to realize that they had to flee. And so they made their way back to Damietta. It was very, very difficult. They really only had one ship that tried to break through the gauntlet, one ship that was able to. Louis refused to be on the ships. He put the sick and the poor and the clergy onto the ships, but he was very ill at this point. And then ultimately they were surrounded by Turan Shah, and the whole crusade had to surrender once again in almost exactly the same location as the Fifth Crusade. So although it went a little differently, it ended up in the same place. Louis himself and the main leaders were all captured and imprisoned. And this was very obviously humiliating for him to be captured. Even worse, while he was in prison, the coup that he had been expecting happened. And when the Mamluks took over, they weren't really sure why they should keep him alive. So there was a very tense time where it wasn't clear whether they would even let he and his other nobles live. The common soldiers, most of them had been just massacred, but the nobles were kept because the idea was that they could get ransom for them. Ultimately, Louis' ransom was literally a king's ransom. They wanted half of it before they would let him go, and then the other half could be paid later. And they would keep the other nobles as hostages during that time. And so Margaret of Provence, who's in Damietta, she has to go through the whole process, working with the people in France and the people that she has there to get this enormous amount of money paid so that Louis can be freed. And so he is freed. In May of 1250, he is let go. And at that point, really the crusade of Louis IX is over. Everyone, they did the best they could. And also his mother is calling for him to come home. She really wants him back. She's getting to be very old. But Louis just refuses to return. Instead, he goes to Acre, and he'll stay there for the next 4 years, doing what he can to help the Crusader kingdom. He can't get Jerusalem back, but he can work out the various negotiations between the Crusader kingdom, Egypt, and Syria, which he does a very good job of that. He's also dealing with the new kid on the block, as it were, and that's the Mongols, who have conquered the Far East and China and are now moving into this area. So he's trying to negotiate with the Mongols as well. But ultimately, in 1254, he has to come back. I mean, his mother has already died, and he needs to return back to Paris. His experience in the Holy Land will really identify and inform the rest of his reign. Because when he returns, he's just mortified by the fact that he was humiliated in this way, and that it must be because he had not been faithful enough or he had not been a good enough king to merit being allowed to redeem Jerusalem. And so the rest of his reign, he very much has that in mind. And many of the things that we associate with St. Louis, of the great saintly king who eats with the poor, washes the feet of lepers, sits under the tree of judgment, all of these things that he did, he's doing this all with one eye to Jerusalem, with the idea that if I can be a good enough king, a good Christian king, then God will one day give me the honor of restoring Jerusalem.
Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. We're talking about the Crusades. When we come back, was that desire on Louis' part ever realized?
The church's music from the 20th century. The 17th century. The 11th century. The 8th century. The 4th century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
We're supported by listeners like you. You're listening to Issues Etc.
This is Pastor Matthew Harrison, President of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The LCMS operates the second largest parochial school system in the United States. What can you expect from a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school? There's one race, the human race. And Jesus died for the sins of every man, woman, and child from every land and every nation. Life begins at conception. All life is precious from womb to tomb. And every student, parent, and teacher is created in the very image of God. There's right and wrong, and we know which is which from the Ten Commandments. There are only two sexes, male and female. He created them. Marriage is the lifelong union of one man and one woman. There's such a thing as objective, absolute truth, and it's found in the person and work of Jesus Christ and His Word. To find a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school near you, visit lcms.org/schools.
Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. We're concluding our series on the Crusades. Before the break, you were talking about Louis' obsession with Jerusalem and his desire to return it to Christian hands. Did he ever have the opportunity to do that?
He does. Much later, though. He's very busy. It's a very long reign. But he's constantly thinking about it, very much constantly thinking about it. The Crusader kingdom is in really bad shape by the time he's able to start looking. So by 1266, he's starting to plan this out in a real physical way on going on crusade again. But by that time, you have this new Mamluk Sultan, the Baibars, who was pretty much destroying the Crusader kingdom in the East. He's very, very successful in capturing all of these various things. And so Louis wants to go and undo all of that, to restore the Crusader kingdom. And so in 1267, he takes the cross and announces that he will be going on crusade again. His family members, Charles of Anjou, his brother, says that he will go as well. And other members of his family and some in the court go as well. Not everyone takes the cross. One of the sources that we have for Louis's life is Jean de Jonville, and he went on the First Crusade. But, Louis is a much older man now. And Jean tells Louis that this is a game for young men. You should not be going on the crusade. Your job is to take care of your people here, not to go off on these major enterprises that really should be done by someone younger. But Louis is absolutely determined to go. And so he arranges for a massive fleet to be prepared to leave. And they all sail. Well, first they have a council of war to decide where they're going to go. And there's arguments made back and forth, but it seems pretty clear that Louis had in mind that he wanted to go to Tunis in North Africa. And ever since he announced that he was going to go to Tunis, historians have been wondering why that happened. Tunis, there's no clear reason for that being the spot of a crusade. It doesn't have any real strategic value as far as Egypt or the Holy Land goes. The prevailing idea has been that Louis had some reason to believe that the Sultan of Tunis, Muhammad, was willing to convert to Christianity if there was a Christian army that would defend him. And he probably had that idea maybe from some Dominicans in his retinue. It's not exactly clear. But for whatever reason, he wanted to go to Tunis first. Now, maybe that was only the first stop. It's not clear. In any case, the crusade goes to Tunis, arrives in 1270. They besiege the main city there, Tunis, and they're also waiting for Charles of Anjou. By this time, Charles of Anjou is actually the king of the two Sicilies in southern Italy. It's not far to Sicily, so he's bringing a large number of forces with him. And so they're kind of holding off on Charles because he's been delayed. And they have negotiations with the Sultan of Tunis, but it becomes very clear right away that Muhammad is not converting to Christianity. While they're waiting for Charles, a disease hits the camp. It's not surprising. It's July and August in 1270. It's very hot. This happens frequently in the Middle Ages when you have that many men all together in very hot circumstances. Then disease hits the camp and it spreads very rapidly. Pretty soon, nobles are dying all around him. In fact, Louis's son, who was born on the First Crusade and who comes with him on the Second Crusade, dies just shortly before. Louis himself contracts the disease and he realizes that he's going to die. So he is laid out in his tent. He asks to have ashes laid on the floor, and he wants to lay in a penitential way on the ashes as he dies. He has a crucifix placed in front of him so that he can look at that as he dies. And in his final night, it's heard coming from his tent. He keeps saying, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," and he passes away. Everyone knew that Louis was one of those people who had such a reputation for sanctity during his life that everyone knew that he was going to be a saint. So after his death, in a very Catholic fashion, they took the relics of his body. They took his heart out, which would be then brought to Paris. They, because you couldn't bring the body as relics back because it would decompose, they would essentially boil the flesh off, and then that way you could take the bones and wrap them up. And so those were also brought back to Paris. But everyone knew that he was going to be canonized, and he would be within only 20-some years. He would be canonized, which is very, very rapid. Even today is very rapid to get someone canonized that quickly.
Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. We'll talk about a grand tour of Crusades with the Ottoman Empire at the gates of Vienna next.
Equipping the priesthood of all believers. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
This week on The Word of the Lord Endures Forever, we continue working through Psalm 119 with a wide place, comfort in my affliction. The earth is full of your steadfast love. It is good for me that I was afflicted, and your hands have made me. Join me, Pastor Will Whedon, for The Word of the Lord Endures Forever, your daily 15-minute verse-by-verse Bible study on demand. Listen at thewordendures.org or your favorite podcast provider.
Are you looking for a confirmation gift for the confirmand in your life? Ad Crucem has a huge selection of lovely gifts to suit any budget. See our jewelry or browse our prayer aids with stunning icons, plaques, crucifixes, and certificates. Our personalized ornaments and boxes are other great ideas. And of course, our theologically sound greeting cards complement the gift perfectly. Visit adcrucem.com. That's ADCRUCEM.com.